So it is my privilege to be here today speaking with you on how we could enable resilient digital operations. A little bit of background about myself. I have spent the last 7 years working with organizations globally on improving their digital resiliency. So the reality is, over those 7 years, I've definitely noticed that the only constant is change. And we've seen, obviously, we've been living through a pandemic and the impacts that had on the way we fundamentally live our lives and how business operates. Now, we're going to zoom in a level here, and a lot of the themes that I'm going to talk about do apply to resiliency in general, managing any critical event. But if we look at digital service disruptions or things that threaten our digital resiliency, one of the things I want to cover in today's webinar are some of those challenges and ingredients to success in order to be increasingly resilient. Now, these types of critical events are not isolated to a geography, to a vertical. They impact everybody. So we've worked with organizations that maybe are retail. Well, there's been an increased dependency on e-commerce. You have healthcare that through the pandemic increasingly relied on delivering safe and effective patient care through telemedicine. We have government agencies and communities and cities undertaking the concept of smart cities and IoT devices that will drive an increasing number of functions that shifted from analog to digital. And these are some of the challenges that we face day to day. Obviously, cybersecurity is a threat. IT systems failing or applications being slow or having a general IT outage cause significant pain to fundamentally how we operate. So another thing I want to bring up is change is the only constant. A lot of organizations have been undertaking the big, hairy, audacious goal of modernizing their technology stack, embracing digital transformation to keep up with those changing times. And understanding that change is often the culprit of negative consequences and results is this balancing act. As an organization, how quickly am I able to innovate, to harness the power of emerging technologies without disrupting my reliability and day-to-day operations? And it's no secret that according to Gartner, about 85% of performance incidents can be tracked to some sort of change. It'd be a code change, an infrastructure change, a configuration change. And depending on what type of change we're talking about, it's not uncommon for those to be handled by different teams using their own technology. So we definitely will be discussing silos. Silos are a difficult thing to deal with across all areas of operations, but we're going to really focus on the IT aspect as well. And what are those necessary ingredients to successfully embrace innovation, succeed in digital transformation initiatives without impacting operations and reliability of the services that we're offering. So focusing on some of the pain points and current challenges today, I do want to highlight just a couple. We'll be talking about a lot more than just this, but I do want to call to attention a couple of alarming statistics to frame up some of the conversation that we will be having over the course of the next hour. First is IT systems are increasingly complicated, and there is multiple ownership silos. So if I do have an IT system or application performing poorly, or it seems like there is a performance incident, it's not readily apparent if this is an issue with the application or service itself, the infrastructure that it runs on, or the network that it's connected to. And there's different teams that manage these different areas. So that first bullet point from a study done by Forrester, up to 70% of the total mean time to restore, mean time to repair a critical IT incident is often spent on just locating the required technical personnel. A lot of organizations struggle to weave through all of the interdependency to find that root cause and engage all of the technical responders needed. The other reality is that IT downtime is very expensive, and this is increasingly expensive. This number is actually a couple years old. It's gone up since then. But from a study done by Gartner, an average organization, regardless of vertical, it is a blended average, organizations can lose up to $5,600 per minute due to an outage. And what builds up that cost is a number of areas. One is if it's a revenue generating service, then that's immediate loss. If there's unplanned downtime or work or overtime required to actually get these issues resolved, that's another operational cost. And if it's anything breach related or data has been compromised and we are in a regulated space, then there could be additional penalties and costs after the fact if it pertains, data as well. So all of those factors do make the importance of making sure our services are reliable usually at the top of a priority list of agencies, organizations, both corporate and public. Now, another reality is that when an incident goes major, this issue itself is cross-functional. It's not isolated to just one team. And the example I mentioned earlier, yes, we have an issue, but can we be sure it's not related to a vendor, or it's not related to network performance issues, or it's not related to maybe a recent code change or update? There's a lot of factors that result in a typical major incident process actually spanning over 5 unique ownership silos. And if you think of what a typical major incident process looks like, there's obviously going to be technical triage. There could be change management that gets involved. Maybe we need an emergency change to be committed into the environment in order to restore service or resolve the incident. So those are just some of the ownership silos that exist. And that goes to the next point, is a lot of those ownership silos from a process perspective also utilizes their own tools. So technology sometimes has the side effect of enforcing some silos as opposed to breaking through them, as different areas of IT do use tools specific to their function. So if you look at a network operations center, they likely have their own monitoring tools. If you look at the IT service management space, they're usually leveraging a big ITSM platform like a Sherwell, Remedy, or ServiceNow. You look at a help desk for individuals that are calling in. Sometimes there's different software there that's utilized, like a CRM platform to manage some of that intake. Then there's collaboration tools. So there's multiple tools, multiple preferences, and we have to find a way to bring all of those together, which is definitely a theme that we'll be talking about today. The other element is being reactive in dealing with incidents as they come in. It prevents us from being able to focus on automating solutions and generating additional innovation opportunities. So from a study, Incident Management Age of Centricity, we polled hundreds of IT leaders from all different verticals, and 72 responded that their ability, their time is being spent resolving issues as opposed to looking for automations, which will allow us to be more resilient. So that's definitely a challenge we'll also be walking through. And then the lack of how we communicate is also important. Communication is also going to be an overarching theme in today's presentation. And it is quite shocking when you look at incident management processes, how many rely on email as a modality and means of communication. Email is yet another IT service that can be victim to an outage, a disruption. So email is not the most resilient means of communication. Now, I believe at this time we'll have our first polling question to come in. Not going to spend too much time on this slide, but please feel free to answer that from a challenge perspective. According to Forrester, where is time typically spent when we're dealing with major incidents? Okay. Polling questions seem to freeze me up. So moving on, bringing back to silos and where they originate and how they progress downstream in an organization. The first thing I do want to mention is there are operational silos at the highest level, right? So we're looking at business continuity management or HR or physical security, digital operations. Those are all very high level operational silos. And that's where the pain actually begins. If from an operations standpoint, there is a lack of interoperability across these areas because they are related. A business continuity issue could be related to a impending digital disruption. Let's say there's severe weather or a hurricane about to hit our data centers. If that's an event that's being treated in silos, that may cause subpar results in terms of being resilient when that event occurs. And it only gets worse from there. All of these operational silos result in process silos. So if we're talking about physical risk management, digital risk management, in terms of cybersecurity, engagement, developing any potential, homegrown solutions or portals, IT incident management, crisis management, those all become process silos. And those processes tend to then be operated within specific tool sets. So then that creates integration silos in terms of all the different tools and technology that could support the business or operating processes that we have in the upper tier. And all of this, once again, will reinforce the statement that I made, that technology, even though it can accelerate a specific function, when not holistically integrated with process and aligned to business objectives, it actually create additional pain when it comes with having silos present in our operations. So now we're going to kind of shift this and mainly focus on IT incident management. How do we actually manage our incidents when they come in? And I do like to introduce 4 categories that we typically see in the industry, and I'll highlight some of the characteristics that accompany each one of these categories. So the first one I do want to talk about is a traditional IT operations process. This is one that's typically driven by things like service desk tickets and usually have quite a few of manual steps within them. This is also a process category that I would consider to be primarily reactive as opposed to proactive. So an example of this would be, there is an issue, maybe I'm in the NOC and I'm looking at my monitoring tools and I'm receiving alerts. This could be a significant business challenge that causes an operations disruption. I'm usually triaging this, some manual engagement going to my incident management teams. Then we have technical triage that takes place, manual communication to actually find and assemble the right personnel. That's where that Forrester statistic of 70% is spent on locating the technical resources. Then there's the actual steps I need to take to resolve the IT disruption. And then there's often steps that take place even after the service is restored. And when it comes to incident management, obviously we're usually measured against a service level objective, a goal, a target in terms of what our MTTR needs to be and restore service successfully when we have major incidents. So the reason I mention this as reactive is typically driven off of a ticketing system, an ITSM tool, right? That's where you have your Surewells, your remedies, and it's great to have record, but not every disruption needs to become an incident. There is underlying cost of making everything an incident ticket because there's human resources and human capital being spent on actually closing and interacting with every incident. So very reactive, structured, it does capture the data, but doesn't necessarily accelerate our response time. Now, what we do see is a fundamental shift of traditional ITIL practices to starting to take concepts and principles from the DevOps playbook and be a little bit more agile. So the low-hanging fruit, I call this enhanced, still traditional, maybe still primarily driven off of a ticketing platform or your ITSM system. But in this case, we're automating the communications. So instead of referencing a IT ticket or monitoring event, connect those tools with a scalable multimodal communications engine to automate that triage. So being able to integrate with service dependency maps and integrate with our CMDB, so we actually know who we need to reach out to alleviate that find and assign part of the process. And just doing that does shrink out significant time to make sure that we're more consistently meeting our SLAs and mitigating the negative impacts of IT downtime. But still pretty reactive. We're still triaging incidents. We're still taking manual steps to resolve and restore. But just automating the communication aspect, it does make a pretty significant impact. Then we take it a step further and we start extending the value of existing technology by correlating events and actually using the power of AI and machine learning. There's usually not a lack of tools in a given organization. There's usually multiple monitoring systems, whether it's an application performance monitor or a network performance monitor. There's usually not a lack of the quantity of tools. But when those tools operate within silos and don't share data with one another, it tends to create a lot of noise and sometimes false positives. So what this slide is indicating is, hey, we have all of these various monitoring systems, ticketing systems. How about we correlate some of that data together based on our CMDB? And instead of sending 15 different messages, send one consolidated message, because when incidents go major, it typically does require cross-functional response. Maybe I have engineers and SREs engaged, major incident managers, the folks that own the service from an ITSM perspective, and it goes beyond that. If it's impacting the public, maybe I have other internal folks I need to engage to communicate to the public, or if it's a customer-facing service, customer support, what have you. There's a lot of individuals and teams that need to be engaged, and that also should include business continuity teams. If this is a service that does facilitate specific public functions, I do need business continuity to also be in the loop. And that's where we'll talk a little bit about the concept of a fusion center that kind of combines physical and digital risk into one space. And the only thing here that's still slowing us down is still manual resolution and some manual steps that typically exist in the restoration phase, such as a post-mortem analysis and all of that good stuff. And then we have adaptive incident management that shifts from modern. The previous one that you saw is modern, and here we have an adaptive model that actually further enhances automation, fully adopts principles from DevOps to make sure that I am automating anything that can be reasonably automated. Things like service scale-ups or restarts that are otherwise manually performed, we could perform that in an automated fashion, log them, and then handle that as a problem management exercise. So at least there's still an underlying problem. We shouldn't be restarting services or scaling up services just to keep the lights on, so to speak. But at least what we're doing here is mitigating the immediate impact of an IT incident. And then we go more into a problem management type of view where we're investigating the underlying problem, but we don't have the pressure and the constraints of individual incidents that are creating fires for the organization and specific functions. So automated remediation is that most mature model of incident response. And that's all of them here. A quick recap of how it progresses and what impact they have. So traditional ops, manual communication is that low-hanging fruit that a lot of organizations will try to tackle first, because it is cumbersome. Who's on call? Do I have a centralized on-call management system? Is it up to date? Do I need to manually escalate when at 3 in the morning a technologist doesn't respond to the page? That does add to the risk of us breaching an SLA. Then we have the automation of the communications, but still manual triage. Maybe we're still receiving multiple signals from monitoring platforms. And then we have the AI ops component, where we actually could centralize and enrich data and extend the investment of monitoring platforms. And last but not least, we have the harnessing the full potential of automation and take some of those lower level events that could escalate to a major incident and preventing it from ever getting into that spot with automated remediation. So with that being said, we will have another poll question for the audience. And this one, I really love seeing the feedback from those categories, which are a rough template. Sometimes you can be in between categories, and we added some descriptive of, hey, one that we didn't cover is ad hoc, right? No formal process. People, you're really reacting. Someone is calling in of an incident, and maybe now you're creating the ticket in the ticketing platform. So that's a completely reactive process, and maybe nothing that's documented or repeatable. You kind of handle your fires as you go. And the other four were covered in the deck of traditional, enhanced, modern, and adaptive. Would love to see where the audience thinks from a self-assessment perspective how your organization is performing based on some of these. Excellent. So I will continue. So now that we kind of talked about the categories of incident management that we see, what are some of those ingredients? Now, there is no one silver bullet. It's going to be a combination of several necessary ingredients to build in that resiliency in our digital operations. The first one is what we like to refer to as signal enrichment or noise reduction. Noise reduction is more of a benefit, a positive side effect, so to speak, but signal enrichment is usually the first step, and it embraces digital transformation in the sense that you're not doing a rip and replace, right? That's not the answer to our challenges, at least not the first stop. The first stop usually is making sure that we're extending the value of existing investments. The reality is, especially now, we don't live in a world of unlimited budgets and unlimited spending on tooling, and just tooling isn't always the answer. And I always like to use this example with monitoring systems. And the events that they generate is what I refer to as a signal. So you could be getting multiple signals from multiple tools. Having yet another monitoring system isn't always the answer. It's being more efficient with the monitors that you already have in place, making sure the triggers are correct, but then making sure that those triggers don't get triaged in a silo. It's very important to enrich those signals from other adjacent monitoring tools. An example I do like to use is, hey, a service is having an issue, and that's being reported by an APM solution. Fill in the blank here in terms of what tool that is for you. Now, from that APM solution, maybe I'm going to investigate and talk to my development team and see, was there any recent changes made to the service? Well, why not integrate with my code base? Why not pull that data proactively, whether it be a GitHub, for example, of, hey, let me grab and see if there's a change to that service. Or, hey, let me see if there's been related incidents open in the last 7 days for this particular configuration item. Let's actually enrich that signal as much as possible and then begin alerting on it. So that way we're reducing alert volume and we're making the alerts more impactful by extending the value of more than just one ticketing monitoring platform. Then we obviously have automated and proactive remediation. Now, this doesn't have to always be full remediation, but it could be the automation of repetitive tasks, or it could be proper event management. Far too often I work with organizations and I see that their monitoring systems just blindly create incidents. Well, that's great. At least that's the traditional model. You do have an incident and you have one record to work off of. But still not ideal, because not every event should be treated as an incident. Some of them are lower impact, lower priority, and it shouldn't need to escalate to be an incident or a major incident. Or even if I'm talking about proactive remediation, a lot of organizations will start pretty small and maybe just automate manual steps in the response playbook. Maybe your playbook has a step to, hey, when there's a major incident, you're creating a Teams channel or a Slack channel or, a WebEx Teams channel. That's an example of activity that could be automated, right? That is effort that's being spent, multiple tools being navigated, and examples of some of those pain points we talked about in the very onset of this presentation. Next is service intelligence and expand this beyond just services. It could also be inclusive of infrastructure, but it's really understanding the dependencies in an easily digestible way. Sure, this is why CMDBs exist, and I always like to refer as a CMDB as a little bit like Bigfoot. We all know what a fully fleshed out configuration management database should look like with all the dependencies defined, but finding one that is up to date and fully fleshed out is a little bit like Bigfoot, right? We all know what it looks like, but seeing one in the wild is a little bit more difficult. So the concept of a service catalog and having dependencies visually represented is very helpful for resources when we're dealing with a major incident and understanding who we may need to pull in proactively instead of spending a lot of time on triage and that find and assign step. So do we understand, if I'm talking about a piece of infrastructure, what services run on it, what microservices make up that service? Because all of those are typically managed by individual, teams that we may need to involve. Next is runbooks. So some organizations that are more on the right side of the maturity model when dealing with IT incidents do have investments in runbook automation tools, your Chef, Sensible Towers, Puppets. So is there well-defined rules of engagement, so to speak, permissions to properly execute service-centric automation? So if I have an issue with a service and my team, I know that teams usually do X when Y happens, is that something I could automate, at least attempt that automation to, once again, the problem is still there, whatever caused the issue is still something we need to investigate, but at least we avoided an incident. We avoided a customer impacting event. And this also could not only include technical integrations, this could also be business process automations as well. On the corporate side, we have customers that sometimes, hey, if this service is customer impacting, let's automatically engage your customer support team and all of that and give them the details so they're not reacting to customers reporting a particular issue. So this could extend to business process, and this could be a great mechanism to break down some of those business silos that occur within an organization. And then there's analytics, data. I've heard the term of data is the new oil. And there's a lot of data out there that you typically do have that's being generated by multiple tools. Do we have a good way to centralize it, visualize it, understand it, actually leverage it to enhance my organization's critical thinking, right? Evolve process, change, bottlenecks, all of that should be data-driven decisions from analytics. Do I have that, or is my data in a million different spots in different areas of the organization? Just look at their data, and that could be a barrier of changing and keeping up with the inevitable, innovation that's happening in the digital space. So another polling question from those, ingredients to digital resiliency at a high level. One that I don't have listed on the slide, but one that we talked about is also just, hey, automated communications would be great. But which one of these is a top priority, right? They could be all of them. That could be, a desired answer. But if you were going to pick just one, what is a focus area either for your function or your perception of your organization when it comes to being resilient with digital services? Is it, taking advantage of my monitoring systems? Is it being more proactive with remediation? Is it maybe you do have a big project on modernizing your CMDB and understanding dependencies, or more into the runbook automation or analytics? So thank you in advance for answering those. So now I want to, instead of just talking, higher level concepts, I do want to show what good looks like when we're managing any critical event, but we'll specifically focus on something like an IT system failure, right? What are the typical phases or categories that we see in the industry? And we're going to talk about this in critical event management, but I'll be more prescriptive from a IT incident perspective as we go through this demonstration. But the first step is understanding what is happening at an event level. So once again, I could be sitting in the NOC and maybe I'm receiving a tool from a network performance monitoring tool. I could be an SRE that supports a specific service, looking at application performance monitoring tools. I could be an incident manager that does follow that traditional, ITIL framework. And as events come in, I want to make sure I'm triaging and resolving them in accordance to my SLA. Wherever I sit, or I could be in customer support, or folks are submitting tickets and I have to triage them that way as well. So the first thing is across areas, not just IT incident response, but dealing with any critical event. The reality is I have to aggregate multiple data sources. So I may need to know, are there related tickets in a ticketing system? What other alerts may exist in other adjacent monitoring systems? So it's all about making sure that we are getting the most out of our investments before we could look at, retooling or anything from that perspective. The first step is usually understanding what efficiencies I can gain with what I have. And that usually frees up budget and capital for other digital transformation initiatives that we may be undertaking. So that is really the first step, is getting more with what you have. And how you do that really comes together with the concept of signal enrichment. So this alert, this could be an email, this could be, an SMS, however you're receiving your alerts today. The concept is the same. So regardless if it's, an alert coming from an APM solution, usually organizations stop there, or far too many of them do, is they get an email from a monitoring system, a SolarWinds, a New Relic, what have you. And that has the core event details of that particular event. So that is telling me what happened. If I could extend the reach of that and maybe send that in a multimodal fashion, more resilient, not just email, but maybe an SMS that is routed to someone that's actually on call and supporting that service, that is a win. That's a step in the right direction. And that would be an example of that enhanced model of incident response. However, I'm still lacking why it happened. So that's where we talk about the concept of signal enrichment. Maybe I could integrate with a tool like RabbitMQ and see what's happening from an infrastructure perspective. Are there bottlenecks in the queue? Is this indicative of something that's not really isolated to my service and could pose a larger operational challenge or a major incident? Has there been a change recently? If it's the service, let's check the code base. Has there been a recent release? Has there been a code change? Has it been committed? What are some of those details? Is it in production? Has it been deployed into my production environment? Has there been remediation already attempted? Maybe I don't have to waste time doing something that we already tried to maybe execute a runbook, but it failed. Having all of that information in one place, as opposed to getting bombarded by multiple alerts, is going to be far more effective. So this is giving us insights and situational intelligence of, hey, not only do I have an event, and here's some other data points from other tools in my ecosystem that could provide insights of why it happened. We want to get to that root cause because we want to streamline the triage time as well. The manual engagement, we talked about up to 70%, and the triage traditionally eat up a lot of time when we're responding to digital events. So anything we can do to remove that friction happens in that assess phase, and that's where the concept of signal enrichment does come in. There's a lot of orchestration that we could do when it comes to locating our desired individuals, understanding who needs to be engaged from a technical perspective, and then proactively who needs to be engaged from a business perspective and an operations perspective of key stakeholders. And it's really having a good understanding of the framework. So what are some of those mission critical systems that support specific, operations of your organization? And once we understand what those systems are, that gives us an insight to the priority. If I know how a particular system or even a subcomponent maps to a business process, That absolutely helps me determine the appropriate priority and severity. Once I know the priority and severity, then who's available? There's two parts of the equation that are equally important: is who is responsible. So who is the technical team that has the expertise or the capability to resolve a particular challenge. But then there's the who's available aspect as well. As you know, IT disruptions don't tend to wait for convenient business hours. They do happen at all hours of the day, or unfortunately night. So who's available, and is it up to date? If the first person doesn't answer, who do I go to next? Is that manual? Is that automated? A lot of that are fundamentals that help us go from that traditional to enhanced model we reviewed earlier. And how do I know who's responsible? Well, that is having service intelligence and an understanding of how business services tie to business functions and tie to other microservices as well. So understanding the dependency and how they relate will greatly help us narrow down the root cause. So those dependencies are very important. It helps us visualize the potential root cause. Having a CMDB is great, but far too often it lacks a easy to digest visual representation of where are those hotspots that need attention based on what's going on in the environment. And we need to be able to, right from that view, you shouldn't need to swivel seat too many areas to seamlessly engage the owners of that particular service. Have that link to an on-call, have that actually reach out to everyone that you need. And when we go from an act perspective, what do we actually do to resolve the issue? Every team likely has some playbook, some run books that they do execute for their particular service. That's why that knowledge is so important, to route the alerts to the right teams, because they are experts of their particular domain. And from that same view, one of the things that is extremely important is collaboration, not working in silos. So maybe I do have a critical event, and maybe my security team is suspicious that this could be something like a DDoS event, and they have a security incident that they are triaging. But maybe my IT service management team or my infrastructure team is investigating, overall slowness from an infrastructure perspective, and maybe they have their own incident and it escalates to a major incident. But lo and behold, maybe these events were related. Maybe that slowness was actually a side effect of the denial of service attack. And it's very important to be able to engage cross-functionally. And one of the mechanisms to do so is leverage the power of tools that likely already exist in your environments. And those are your collaboration platforms, your Microsoft Teams, your Slack, your WebEx. There are others. Those are just examples. It's important to be very tool agnostic when we are tackling the challenge of critical event management. So all these different functions, how do we bring them together effectively? How do we not rehash the same conversations that we maybe were already having when you have new people joining the bridge or the collaboration space? How do I share that data in a proactive and transparent way? And that then combines with the concept of workflow automation. So collaboration is very important. It's a required part of the process because things are so interdependent. The reality is we likely can't hit a button and do all of our automations, as it does impact other areas of IT. But going back to our service intelligence, a key thing that I wanted to add here is executing service-centric automations. There's automations that will only make sense and are only applicable to a particular service. Let's make sure that whenever we have common ones that we need to execute, or we leverage data from the past and we analyze, hey, we had this particular incident occur 30 times over the course of the year, and 20 of those times this was the resolution. Can we automate it so it doesn't happen again? Can we auto trigger it so it doesn't cause significant pain? Those are all examples of how teams, from a decentralized perspective, will start adding service-centric automations that can be more quickly executed and communicated to all required stakeholders. And process automation is really important. So we talked about the concept of tooling. There's a lot of overlap in tools that we traditionally see. There's multiple monitoring systems, probably more than one ticketing platform, collaboration tools, sometimes more than just one. And in order to not be subjected to the resulting silos, it's very important for us to be able to use the power of automation to remove manual steps. Everything you see here on the screen, unfortunately, far too often it's being done manually with human capital, right? I'm manually maybe linking this, opening up a Teams channel, attaching it to the ticket, maybe multiple tickets if we have, development issue that's maybe in Jira, an IT service management issue that's maybe in a Remedy or a ServiceNow. How do I bridge the gap and really make data available everywhere? That should be one of our goals as well. Make data available everywhere, because the reality is these tools exist because they are purpose-built. There is going to be different areas of the IT organization that's going to continue using those tools because they're fit for purpose. That's great, but let's make sure that the information that is agnostic, because it's a cross-functional effort to resolve incidents in many cases, let's make it available in both places, everywhere. So from an incident management perspective, whether I'm in tool A or tool B, I have the same updates from a progress perspective, same links to collaboration spaces, so we could remove some of that friction. So automating wherever we can and having those alerts, if we are sending alerts. Communication is often a challenge for a lot of organizations, but it should be viewed as an opportunity. Because with the state of technology these days, communications should also shift from contextual, telling me, hey, this is an issue, this is what happened, to actionable. Can I actually then respond and have that trigger a technical or business process? So if I'm a service owner, I'm the expert of that service, I know that this is a pretty big deal. Can I have a button that launches my major incident management process, right? Or escalates it, or proposes an event to a major incident? Or am I manually picking up the phone or figuring out who's the MIM on call and doing all of that manually, or manually slacking people who I think may or may not be available at that time of day or night? So all of this should be able to feed and integrate with our ecosystem, thus extending the value of a lot of that tooling. And the last stop, what I like to call around the wheel, is analytics. What analytics exist at the micro and macro level? So from an incident management perspective, is there one spot to go to actually see what's happening across multiple tools? What services are actually impacted? What automations were executed? Who was actually engaged? What was the time to respond? When were they paged? When did they respond? To identify any potential bottlenecks or lapses in concepts like on-call coverage. Do I have a running timeline of all my events that happened across my multiple tools? All of these insights are really important to be able to enhance the organizational critical thinking of a process like incident management. These insights should be able to, hey, maybe this is something we can automate, or I've seen this X amount of times over the last year, and this was the resolution. Can it be automated? If it can't be automated, can I at least automate the proposed action to the team that does the work, right? Can we say, hey, last time this is what was done, here are the details? All of those insights are important for continuous improvement. And that's where continuous improvement from a process perspective comes in as well. It should never be linear, which is why the slide is kind of organized in a wheel, because there's always room for improvement. Once we identify a flaw in our process, that usually uncovers other things that we could fix that are at a lower level as well. And then communicate. When an incident's resolved, unfortunately, far too often, a lot of time is spent on the post-incident reporting process, logging into multiple tools and extracting all of that data to then do a post-mortem analysis on that incident. So I know, keep my eye on the time. The last thing, I always try to be a little bit blended with the content that we offer is, can I walk away from this presentation and start adopting how do I get to that desired state? And that's where I like to bring in value stream management. That is a term that actually began in the manufacturing industry, but I think it's a concept that can be applied across the board. So polling question here is, have we heard about value stream management? Do we practice value stream management in our respective areas of operations? Or is it something that we're not really familiar with? Definitely appreciate the response to that. So what I do want to cover here is one of my favorite quotes. The underarching theme of this presentation too is how do I take a traditional ITIL process, a reactive process, and at least, if we're not all developers on the call, of course, it doesn't matter. There's still going to be some relevant practices from the DevOps community on how to be, continuous delivery, continuous improvement. How do I be more proactive than reactive? And I love this definition of DevOps by Peter Dubois. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I love the concept of DevOps is whatever you do to bridge the friction caused by silos. All the rest is engineering. I love that because value stream management addresses the other part of the equation. There is no one piece of technology or tooling that we could do to magically fix our challenges. It's really a combination of tooling and processes. So value stream management allows us to take a holistic view and not get bogged down into the engineering aspects of our challenge. That's often not how to improve the results of a process. So that's really what I really wanted to get out of this slide. And this is why when organizations try to shift to a more DevOps model, they usually get stuck in the middle, because at some point or another, they get sucked into the weeds of engineering and specific technology that may be in place, as opposed to having a more holistic understanding of what their process looks like and identifying some of those constraints to that process. So from a value stream management perspective, once again, represented linearly, I definitely in my mind view this as a circle because the reality is once we identify a constraint in our respective process, only once we fix that constraint will we see the other underlying constraints that are down a level as well. And not going through all of this, we don't have too much time, but I do want to cover that value stream management is all about first identifying what your value streams are in your respective area. So maybe I'm an incident manager and a value stream could be, reduce my MTTR, or communication is a challenge. I want to improve my engagement metrics from technical resources. Or maybe I am in the DevOps space and I want to increase my release cadence. That could be one of my value streams. So it's very important to identify what my value statements are. What are going to be those things that I measure? Once we identify the value streams, then we have to make sure that we bring in all of the required owners of processes or sub-processes that interact with my value stream. And that could be beyond my immediate organization. Anyone that reacts to my value stream, we do want to bring them in and break down some of those silos. Then we want to drive accountability and organize and make sure that I have owners of the process for a particular step. And now we can do a mapping exercise where we actually walk through a particular use case and map every element of the process. What's automated, what's manual, what's some of the waste that we could identify from the current process? Is there something that's redundant or something that's really not necessary, or a bunch of steps that add a bunch of idle time that slow down the end result? And once we do that, then we're able to connect that to our actual tools and sub-processes, but then it's a continual effort of inspection. So now, what are the metrics that we're going to use to measure our progress? All of these should be measurable. So then inspect, are we improving? Adapt, and then we do want to then align it to a longer term vision as well, and iterate multiple times across the value stream. So if nothing else from this presentation, we kind of address some of the high level challenges, some of the themes on how do we improve on those challenges. But engaging in a value stream mapping exercise would be great. It's usually a wonderful way to align the technical areas of the organization to the business areas of the organization. Often there's a wedge between those two areas, and it's also a great way to understand how we do things today cross-functionally. Far too often when I work with organizations, I truly get an understanding of processes, not from one meeting, but likely from meeting with multiple individuals that live within their own silo, so to speak. And it's usually the actions or activities between those silo areas is where I identify the most waste from a process perspective. So I gave some example of, hey, in my major incident management process, how do you engage with change management? What's that look like? Is it automated? Is it manual? How do you share information? Do you collaborate? So when you map all of that out, you'll start, usually the themes that I identify is the transition between some of those ownership silos is where we introduce the most idle time and the most waste from a process perspective. So just sharing this, I love practicing value stream management in my work life, in my personal life. Anything could benefit from this exercise. And like I said, this originated from, I believe, the automotive industry and manufacturing on how to reduce manufacturing waste, but the concepts are truly agnostic in their application. The next thing that I do want to kind of cover and summarize are some of those key required capabilities to be more adaptive in our incident management. And that's the understanding that an event will originate from many different sources: APM solutions, NPM solutions, ticketing platforms, maybe more than one, end users calling in, end users submitting a ticket, someone sending an email. There's a lot of inputs that typically go into our incident management processes. And to assess, integrations are very important. Integrations should also be self-service. It's a dangerous game sometimes to overinvest in developing really complex integrations, because tooling could change. That's the reality. Tooling doesn't tend to be very stagnant. Tools come and they go in a respective organization. So when we build automations, we should be integrating and automating a technical or business process, and we should view as the tools as interchangeable parts, so to speak. So that's where having a workflow that's process centric as opposed to tool centric is going to be what I would consider a recipe for success. Next is, a lot of these various inputs have a lot of data. Based on that data, we should be able to automate where this information should go, which teams should be alerted, which sub teams, and how should they be alerted. And that doesn't just apply to technical responders. We should be proactively notifying stakeholders as well. The reality is, if we fail to do proactive stakeholder communications, that actually creates more waste from an incident management perspective, because your incident volume will go up. And there is an underlying cost to every single incident. There's a cost there. There's time and resources being spent either closing out the duplicates or reviewing it. So something very important to make sure that we understand. Once we route the message, it needs to be resilient. So I should make sure that if I'm not sending it via email, if email is down, no one's going to get it. So there should be multiple ways to communicate. And the reality is, we're communicating to humans, and different people have different preferences. I myself, if you send me an email, that is not the most responsive way to get me engaged. I unfortunately get many of those, but ping me on Slack or send me a message via an SMS is definitely going to have better results. So being able to make sure that the delivery is actually catered to the recipient, and enforcing some best practices from a use case perspective is very important. So, hey, maybe I have an SLA for a P1. So maybe, the escalation time between resources for P1 is going to be 5 minutes, but for P3, 20 minutes. That's completely appropriate, but it should be dynamic, flexible, automated. And then all of that data needs to be accessible everywhere. So whether I'm working an ITSM ticket, or maybe I'm in the NOC and I'm dealing with, monitors that are firing off. I should be able to see the results of my engagement. Once I deem it necessary to reach out to particular resources, I shouldn't need to swivel seat into a different place. Regardless of the tool, it should tell me, hey, this person got paged, they didn't respond, or they responded with this. Here's the link to the Slack channel. Whatever we could do to automate the process, that's absolutely what we should do from a value stream perspective. And it should automatically escalate. So key required capability there in blue is obviously should be multimodal. For your technical teams, it should auto escalate. I shouldn't need to chase people down, see who's on call, who's the escalation. All of that should be automated, because if I'm a major incident manager, I have other responsibilities, especially if I'm in a regulated industry. I got to be taking diligent notes. I got to be capturing, specific information. I'm likely building, an incident timeline. I don't necessarily have the time to manually chase people down. If I make time, then it's slowing down the overall response. Collaboration hub, we should be leveraging all collaboration technology seamlessly. So if part of my process is to spin up a Teams meeting for my technical resolvers, and then also another meeting for my business stakeholders, that should be automated, and it should be integrated to all of those tools. So if I'm in the NOC or the ITSM team, whatever tool I use, I should be able to have multiple points of entry to reduce that mean time to collaborate. Because all of that is a metric, by the way, that a lot of our customers do start tracking as well, is what's the mean time to collaborate, and that usually correlates to restoration time as well. And then what analytics do I have into my response capabilities? Is there a tool agnostic timeline, a detailed audit trail, recordings? Am I archiving the collaboration activity that I'm doing and ingesting it into my ticket or whatever my source of record is for compliance and regulatory reasons? Is it all being done manually? If it is, that's having significant cost and even potentially resulting in turnover in certain areas of your organization if all of these tasks are very manual. So this really is a recap. I think I brought this right to 2 o'clock, and I would like, and Ellie, maybe I'll turn it over to you to see if there are any questions that have come in about any of the content, the ingredients to success on how we can be more digitally resilient. And the overarching theme is removing silos and better integrating our tools and technology. And then the false multiplier is automation, automate where possible. And then how do we do that? We start with something like a value stream mapping exercise that's very cross-functional.